All right, my friends. Hello, happy Monday, and welcome to week 10 of A Push. I really can't believe that we're already 10 weeks into this school year. What a wild ride it has been, and it's only about to get wilder. So, buckle up, because this week we're going to talk about one of the most important transformations in United States political history, at least, which is going to lead to the rise of Andrew Jackson and the era in which we refer to as Jacksonian democracy. Now, you might be wondering, hey, Winch, it sounds a little bit like Jeffersonian democracy, and you'd be correct. There are going to be a lot of similarities to that era in terms of political ideology, but this is going to be a little different in some ways that we'll be able to discuss and evaluate as we continue through this day. Now, just for some context, so that we're all aware, today we're focusing on, and all this week we're focusing on Jacksonian democracy from a political standpoint. You may notice last week was entirely focused on the economic developments of period four with the market revolution and the rise of regional specialized economies. Um, I told you at the beginning of period four happens in layers, right? There's political evolution, there's economic evolution. So this week's our political week, and next week we'll wrap up period four with our social developments as we discuss the Second Great Awakening and the rise of reform movements, trying to fix some of the problems that happen in society when society grows really quickly, like we're seeing here economically, demographically, population wise, territory wise, that sometimes that growth causes growing pains, which are going to be attempted to be resolved by reform movements next week. So that's it. We got 2 more weeks of period four. Time flies. Point is, we can't wait for anybody, and we got to make sure we're marching along, taking care of our business. So this week we're focusing deeply on Andrew Jackson, Jacksonian democracy, and with it will actually come the rise of the second two-party system. As you know from last week, the Federalists are dead and gone. By the end of today's lecture, not today's lecture, by the end of our live session this week, they will be replaced by the Whigs. So we'll get there. So to kind of contextualize today, how did we get here to this point of the rise of Andrew Jackson? Now, first, it's important to note Andrew Jackson is a war hero from the War of 1812. You may recall him winning the Battle of New Orleans, a battle in which, of course, as you all know, the war was already over, but that doesn't matter. It leads to a huge rise in his stature, his popularity. He also then later is going to engage in some Native American raids into Florida and cause a lot of chaos in Florida as a military leader, which is one of the reasons why Spain was so eager to sell Florida to us, because it wasn't worth their time anymore. So Jackson is a war hero that is really the product of this era of good feelings. Now, the era of good feelings has given us an improved economy, but it's also given us an industrialized economy, a more industrialized economy, that is worrisome to some of the farmers and the agrarian and the former like Jeffersonian perspectives on society. It's given us better transportation and infrastructure. Um, the Era of Good Feelings has given us more territory and better defined borders via like the Adams-Onis Treaty for Florida, the Rush-Bagot Treaty for the Great Lakes, the Oregon Agreement with Great Britain to split it. So like we have a better idea of like what our country actually controls and doesn't control. It's given the U.S. a clearer foreign policy in Latin America, which, as you know from last week, is called the Monroe Doctrine, this warning to European nations to stay out. This is our hemisphere to regulate. But the Era of Feelings is breeding some sectional problems between North and South, which we'll talk about deeply in our live session this week, as well as some political problems between those who advocate, again, here we are, same issue. I told you the first time that came up, it would come up all year, but those who advocate for a stronger national government and those who prefer a more limited national government with more rights reserved for the states. So that's kind of our contextualization. We have the real thing that I told you last week, the big problem that begins the end of the Era of Good Feelings is the Panic of 1819. The second thing that begins the end of the Era of Good Feelings is the Missouri Compromise over slavery. So we're starting to see cracks in these good feelings on economic issues, on socio-political issues. The thing that really is an end to the Era of Good Feelings is the election of 1824. So I'm going to leave this map up here for a second and look at this map. Look at this map. You have 4 people running for president. And I told you the first time we looked at election maps, and election maps always tell us a good story. Now we have 4 candidates running for president. Let's look at them. We got John Quincy Adams. He is the son of John Adams. of Alien and Sedition Act fame. We have Jackson, we have Crawford, and we have our friend Henry Clay, who we've talked about before, the Missouri Compromise, one of the war hawks, Clay's American System. So Clay, we've talked about Clay before. We've talked about Jackson before. We talked about Adams' daddy before, but not Adams himself. Crawford, haven't talked about him before. But look at this. We see a very disjointed election. A very disjointed election in which there's no real clear pattern in terms of who the American people are supporting that we can really define on anything except regional lines. We see Quincy Adams having support here in the Northeast, which wouldn't surprise us. His dad was a Federalist. He's from Massachusetts. The Adams family is from Massachusetts, right? There's Massachusetts. So we see Quincy Adams cleaning up in the Northeast. That's important. We see Clay, he's the Western senator, right? So he wins Ohio, a Western state, Kentucky, a Western state, and Missouri, a Western state. So he's got a little bit of Western support. We got Jackson, who kind of has maybe the broadest support geographically, right? He's got some northern states like Pennsylvania and New Jersey. He's got some southern states like South Carolina, North Carolina, and the Deep South down here. He's got some western states that both have slaves like Tennessee and western states that don't have slaves like Indiana and Illinois here. All right. And then we got Crawford, who wins a Deep South state in Georgia. He wins Virginia and Delaware. So we see like this wide variety of support, which runs in contrast to what we saw in 1816 and 1820, where Monroe experienced broad support from a vast majority of the country. So what this tells me is that the Democratic Republicans are beginning to fracture. Right? Instead of having one candidate the party has united behind like they did with Monroe, we're starting to see a breakdown in the support for the political party based on region and others. So this is important. But let's look at this. Who wins this election? Let's see. Well, nobody. Because according to who won the most votes, let's look at the popular vote down here. The most votes is very obviously Andrew Jackson. He won 43% of the votes, 153,000 votes. All right. And the next most votes is Quincy Adams, who's like 45,000 votes behind him. 45,000 votes. All right. And then we got Crawford and Clay not doing too hot. But what if we look at the Electoral College, the thing that actually matters, right? That elects the president. Under the Electoral College rules, you have to win 50% plus one of the votes to be elected president. So let's look at the Electoral College. Here, Jackson wins the most votes again, right? 38%. Second highest is 32%. That says he gets 99 votes. Second place gets 84 votes. So Jackson has the most votes. But he does not have 50% of the votes. So technically speaking, this is the way the beauty of American politics works. Nobody wins the election. Because if nobody gets 50% or more of the electoral votes, the votes that decide the presidency, then the House of Representatives decides. And they have to decide between the top three vote getters. Right? They take the top three, and the House of Representatives will decide with one vote, one decision per state is kind of the way it works. So with that being said, we have our top three here. In first place, Jackson. In second place, Quincy Adams. And barely in third place is our boy Crawford. Which means Clay's eliminated. Poor Clay. Adios, Clay. Fun fact, this will be the first of many times he runs for president. You're going to laugh at this by the end of this semester in terms of how many times he runs for president without winning. It's pretty alarming. Quite sad, really. Except I'm not sad. So this is the chaos that has unfolded. The House of Representatives now has to decide who will be the next president amongst these three people: Quincy Adams, Jackson, and Crawford. Now you might be asking, why doesn't the House of Representatives just pick Jackson because he got the most votes? Good question. Jackson's thinking the exact same thing. Now what happens here, right, the Jackson runs in this four-way race for president, even though all four are technically from the same party. They're all four Democratic Republicans. Each candidate has sectional support from a different candidate, but because nobody won 50%, the top three candidates are voted on the House of Representatives, with each state getting one vote. So we got Jackson, we got Quincy Adams, we got Crawford. Now the fun fact here is the guy who really is in charge of the House of Representatives, the guy who's leading the House of Representatives, that position is called the Speaker of the House, the guy in charge of the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House right now in 1824 is Henry Clay. So the guy that finished fourth and thus is not eligible for this final decision is the guy who's in charge of this final decision. It's kind of funny how that works. So Henry Clay is going to convince the House of Representatives to support John Quincy Adams for president, to vote their support behind John Quincy Adams for president, even though he lost by 6% to Jackson in the Electoral College vote and by 45,000 votes of people who voted. So for Clay is going to convince Congress, the House of Representatives, that Quincy Adams is a better bet for president, and thus the House of Representatives should pick Quincy Adams to be president instead of Jackson. Now, if you were Andrew Jackson, how would you feel? I won more votes. More people voted for me, like Hillary Clinton. And yet the other guy is going to be president because why? Like, what's the justification? And Clay's justification is that he thinks, Clay, of course, the believer in the American system, the bank, the tariff, the infrastructure, he thinks Quincy Adams' vision is better for the country than is Jackson's, who's not a fan of those things, as more of a states' rights Democrat. So he convinces Congress to support Quincy Adams, and thus Quincy Adams becomes the next president, even though Jackson won more votes. Now, 2 weeks later, Quincy Adams names Henry Clay, who helped get him the presidency via this runoff election. 2 weeks later, Quincy Adams names Clay his new Secretary of State, which is a very important position. This looks a little shady. Andrew Jackson is furious because he's like, you traded the presidency for a position as Secretary of State. He's mad specifically to Henry Clay because he's like, Clay, you convinced Congress to vote for Quincy Adams, and then Quincy Adams gave you one of the most important positions in government. That looks shady. That looks corrupt. So Jackson and his supporters start calling this the corrupt bargain. The corrupt bargain. Because their argument is that Clay had all the power and he gave Quincy Adams the presidency in exchange for becoming the Secretary of State. Go figure. It's this election that really starts to fracture the Democratic-Republican Party and the American people, but it really mobilizes Jackson's supporters to rally behind him in a much more aggressive way. And you might be asking yourself, like, what the hell is the big deal with the Secretary of State? Is it even that cool of a position? Let me show you why it is. So George Washington's Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. 4 years later, he becomes president. Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State was James Madison. He's the next president. James Madison's Secretary of State was James Monroe. He's the next president. James Monroe's Secretary of State is John Quincy Adams. He's the next president. John Quincy Adams' Secretary of State is Henry Clay. He's not going to be the next president. But now you see why Jackson and his supporters would be so furious, because it looks like Henry Clay has done this to put himself in position to be the next president at the expense of all those people that voted for Andrew Jackson. So as we can see, there's a whole bunch of nobodies over here on the vice president side, well, Adams and Jefferson. But Burr and George Clinton and Elbridge Gerry and Daniel, like none of those people become president. But almost all these people become president. So the Secretary of State is a very important position, and it looks to Jackson and his supporters like Clay traded the presidency to Quincy Adams in exchange for becoming Secretary of State so he could become the next president. Looks pretty shady. So because of the way the election started, because of the way his presidency started, without even having broad support, without even having actually won the election, Quincy Adams is a really difficult struggle bus of a president. Quincy Adams wants to continue the nationalist type programs that we saw enacted in the era of good feelings, right? The bank, the tariff, America, yay, everything's good, pride, nationalism, But he takes office right after a couple years after the Panic of 1819. So the economy's in worse shape, which is going to limit Adams' agenda. To try to fix some of the Panic of 1819 problems, they pass a protective tariff, which I talked about in class last week, to try to help farmers and industry, but this really makes the South mad, so there's some sectional problems at hand as well. His one big success, right? Both he and his dad have presidencies in which you can name one success, so maybe they're not the best presidents. His one big success is he does get the national road authorized, which is going to be prepared to unite the East and the West on a national road. Of course, this nationalist agenda of federal government funded infrastructure. Quincy Adams' big accomplishment as president was a national road. Get some, John Quincy Adams. It looks like this. It connects right outside of the capital, Washington, D.C. in Baltimore. And it's going to connect all the way through Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana, the whole old Northwest territory, and eventually connect with the city of St. Louis on the Mississippi River, again, to try to unite East and West in a more cohesive manner, which is a big deal. Right? John Quincy Adams, also fun fact, is the first president to be photographed. He lives long enough at the end of his life to be around when cameras are around. And as you can see, he is a delightfully attractive, very handsome man who served as president. He looks great. No, he does not look great at all. His administration, he's trying to pursue policies that are in line with Clay's American system, but he's running up against trouble from Democratic Republicans who don't like these nationalist policies. The end of his presidency, he enacts a very strong high tariff that makes the South very, very angry. That we'll circle back to next class, on our live session. He is very, very generous with Native Americans. He doesn't believe in forcibly removing Native Americans from their land, which is also going to make people angry who want this land. So these three things, right? His support for Clay's American system, his tariff, and the fact that he's very generous and kind to the Native Americans are all going to also contribute to Jackson's supporters being really angry. They're already mad about the corrupt bargain. Jackson supporters are largely states' rights, small farmers, everyday people. So they're mad about Clay's American system. They're mad about the tariff. They're mad about the Native Americans. So Jackson supporters are incredibly motivated and very angry at Quincy Adams, and thus even more strongly in support of Jackson and his policies. So that's one of the reasons why Jackson's rise happens, is this anger for the corrupt bargain and this anger for Adams' administration. Right? Jackson proclaims himself the hero of the common man. I'm a war hero. I'm from the frontier. I'm rough. I'm college educated. I'm not college educated. I'm not all polished like these politicians. I'm a man of the people. And in this time period, we're going to start letting the people vote more frequently and more willingly. So in this time period as well, kind of this perfect storm, states are gradually removing the two restrictions they had on who could vote. Of course, not women, not people of color, not African Americans, not former slaves, any of that. But in terms of white males, we're seeing states getting rid of the property requirement to vote, having to own property to actually vote in state elections, and the tax restriction on voting, meaning if you don't pay a tax, meaning you don't have a job, then you can't vote. So as states are getting rid of property requirements and tax requirements to vote, what we're going to see then is we're letting more common people vote. And if you let more common people vote, who are they going to vote for? They're going to vote for somebody who reflects their desires, their ideals, their perspectives, their priorities. So as we let more common people vote, right, by 1840, 90% of common white men are allowed to vote. We call this universal white male suffrage. It's often called universal male suffrage, which is inaccurate because only white males are still able to vote. Make sure we're precise with our language and specific. So this rise of universal white male suffrage is also going to lead to a rise of candidates who have to appeal to everyday people. right? So no longer can they take the federalist approach of appealing to the elites and the educated and the upper class, because now we're letting everybody vote, if everybody was a white male, and thus politicians need to appeal downward to more everyday type folks. We see politicians doing things like this in this picture. It's an awesome picture of like an outdoor rally for sharing political ideas. Vote for me, vote for me. You have people going out to the everyday folks, having barbecues, bringing beer and whiskey and asking people to vote for them. Of course, here, even in this one, we have 2 dogs. And look at us, always a dog. All right, and because of this, we're going to see a huge increase in participation. By 1840, 80% of eligible voters are going to vote as America becomes a more democratic place because we've removed restrictions on who can vote and who can participate. All right, this is what it looks like in 1800. Most states have a property requirement or a taxpayer requirement to vote. By 1830, that is no longer the case, as yellow with universal male suffrage, white male suffrage, and America becomes a more democratic place, and thus the era of Jacksonian democracy is an era of increased democracy. So because of the way they lost in 1824, the Jacksonians, the supporters of Jackson and Jackson himself, are going to create, for the first time really, a well-organized national campaign. They're going to use the press. They're going to use groups of people that are going to be mobilized. They're going to go town to town, right, rallying up support, getting people ready to vote, getting as many people excited about Jackson as possible. It's the first campaign. Like now, you put on your TV, right? We have an election in 2 weeks. You put on your TV, and like every freaking other commercial is like, vote for me, vote for this prop, vote for this guy, all those things. 1828 is the first time in which people are really trying to mobilize support for a presidential election. A well-organized national campaign. So what we're seeing Jackson do, which is really smart, is he's going to form a broad coalition. He's going to form a coalition, a group, if you will, a team that's going to involve Adams' vice president, who's John C. Calhoun. He's from South Carolina, right? And with South Carolina's support, he's going to get like the Southern vote, the slaveholding vote, the pro-cotton, anti-tariff vote, okay? He, as Jackson, he's from the West, from Tennessee, so he's going to already get some of the Western support because of his ideology and where he's from. So now we got the South cleared up, we got the West cleared up. He's going to use a guy named Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren is going to be a really important character going forward. And he's from New York, right? Not a Southern or a Western state. He's from New York. But he's going to use Van Buren to appeal to the working class white vote in northern cities. Right? If you remember, thanks to industrialization, we have this new class of people that didn't really exist before. Right? And that's wage workers, workers who go to work for somebody else for a wage, for like a small paycheck. This wage worker class, and largely like Irish immigrants in northern cities like New York, Van Buren's ideologies are going to be attractive to them. And he's going to use newspaper editors as well to publish stories that are pro-Jackson, so that way they can run against John Quincy Adams in a much more organized fashion. This whole way of like building a coalition of like Southern support, Western support, Northern support, working to cobble together these groups, they're going to form the basis of the first modern political party, the first political party that looks a lot like our political parties do today, and they're going to call themselves the Jacksonian Democrats, and then eventually just the Democrats, okay? They don't look at all, nothing like the Democratic Party today, so ignore that, scratch that from your mind. I promise you'll learn a lot about political party evolution in this class, but Jacksonian Democrats, they have the same name as the Democrats today, but that's just about it. Cool. So the Democrats are going to distinguish themselves or differentiate themselves from the other group in their own party, that they were the Democratic Republicans, from the more nationalistic Republicans like Clay, like Quincy Adams, who have strayed or left the Jeffersonian ideals of small government, limited authority, strict interpretation, states' rights. Their argument is that their party has embraced too much big power, big government stuff, so they need to form their own little breakout party that goes back to doing the way things Jefferson would have wanted them to do. So these Jacksonian Democrats are going to look a lot like the Jeffersonian Democrats, but not entirely. There'll be some differences. And one of the main differences is that they reflect the idea that this is a new, more industrialized society, and thus they need to appeal to the working class, where in Jefferson's days there was no real working industrial class and there was no need to do that. So one difference. So 4 years after Quincy Adams gets elected by that shady, corrupt bargain, the election of 1828 is going to really change American politics. It's going to show the effectiveness of organization, right? Jackson and his supporters will be really organized. They're going to mobilize support and increase voter turnout. It's the first election where we see like overt, which means like obvious mudslinging, trash talking propaganda, which is supposed to make your candidate look good and the other candidate look bad. And Jackson and his supporters are going to work really hard to appeal to the average man, having public rallies, having barbecues. And Jackson wins the election by a large margin by demonstrating himself as a common man of the people, as a rough and tumble guy. He is a little rough, I'll tell you this much. All right, he has a bullet lodged in his collarbone from a duel that actually is probably going to kill him later from lead poisoning, as the bullet stuck in his collarbone is going to gradually dissolve lead into his bloodstream. One of the reasons, I mean, obviously, it's a long time ago and healthcare is not what it was. Healthcare is not what it is now, but likely one of the reasons he dies is from lead poisoning from that bullet. Jackson is also married to a woman who was married before and maybe not quite divorced when they got married. So there's all kinds of trash talking going on back and forth. The argument is that Miss Jackson is a bigamist, meaning she's been married to more than one man at a time. The response from Jackson's supporters is that John Quincy Adams is wife is a bastard wife, which is also hilarious and crazy. But it's the first time where you see like candidates directly attacking like each other and their families, and it gets a little wild. We see the same thing now in 2020, right? Trump is convinced that Biden has dementia as he bumbles on with his dentures, and things go wild. But the Democrats are going to paint Jackson as his nickname of Old Hickory. Old Hickory. And hickory's a really like a southern, really, really hard, sturdy tree. And it says he's as strong and as sturdy and as stable as an old hickory tree. And they're going to say these things as if he's a good thing, right? He's uneducated, like that's a good thing. He's a war hero. He's a dueler. If he disagrees with you, he'll take you out back and you can have a duel and shoot each other. He's a man of the people, right? And Quincy Adams, he's like the old guard. He's an aristocrat. He comes from this political family. They've been in politics too long. Pick the new fresh face who's a man of the people. Go figure. But look at this election map. Jackson wins overwhelmingly, right? 68% of the electoral vote goes for him. This time there's no doubt. This time the House of Representatives doesn't have to decide because Jackson has won overwhelmingly and Jackson becomes the next president of the United States, making John Quincy Adams a one-term president, just like his dad. So funny. Let's think about this for a second. Let's think about our presidents up to this point. Washington, he got 2 terms because he got reelected. Adams, 1 term. Jefferson, he got 2. Madison, he got 2. Monroe, he got 2. He got reelected in the middle of the Panic of 1819. Like, yeah, he got 2. John Quincy Adams, just like his dad, 1 term. 1 term. What does that say? And then his inauguration, his speech to the American public as they inaugurate him into office, as they enter his term, his inauguration turns into because he's a man of the common people. A bunch of common people show up to Washington, D.C. to celebrate their guy getting elected. It turns into a rowdy mess. Supporters of his like storm into the White House and they make a giant mess and they steal all the cheese and they get drunk on the wine. And it's a perfect inauguration that demonstrates exactly who is supporting Andrew Jackson and why. The cheese, though. They ate all the White House cheese. It's messed up. But Jackson's victory in his presidency is going to actually split the Democratic Party, which we're already kind of seeing, right? The Jacksonian Democrats versus those nationalist Republicans. We had our era of the Federalists with Washington and Adams looking good. We had this era of the Democratic Republicans having the White House for 8, 16, 24, 28 years. Jackson will get his 2 terms that we'll talk about this week. And there, the Democratic Republicans are going to split into 2 groups, the Democrats under Jackson and the Whigs under Quincy Adams and Clay that prefer more national party. Jackson and his supporters, they want to go back to the way Jefferson envisioned this party, right? States' rights, protection of individual liberties by having a limited government, pro-Western expansion, okay? And they're worried that this other faction in their party has done too much to embrace national power a strong central government, etc. So our new ideology is going to look a little bit like this. A little bit like this. We still have John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, as an old Federalist who's on the side of the most national supremacy possible, which we see in those court rulings that I talked about in class last week. We'll talk about another one today. So John Marshall is like to the farthest side of pro-national supremacy. Then we have the National Republicans who become the Whigs, like Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. We have the Jacksonian Democrats who prefer more states' rights, like Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. And to the farthest side, on ultimate states' rights, is going to be like pro-nullification, like we saw with the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions, are people like John C. Calhoun, who I argue is quite possibly the ugliest man in American political history. Because look at that guy. Look at that guy. You'd be angry too if you looked like that. So Jackson's two-term presidency is defined by three major conflicts that we'll talk about, and a whole bunch of minor conflicts, right? Including within his own government. And you read about some of this, like the Peggy Eaton affair. I'm not going to talk about that, but it's in your text. Know it. A lot of chaos. But, we brought all this new blood into politics, and with new blood comes some chaos and some upheaval. The only two issues I'm going to talk about today are the spoils system as well as Indian removal. The spoils system is going to be a system that's going to be in place for the next about 50 years in American politics, and it's going to have some pretty important ramifications, and it's going to be started by Jackson, so we're going to leave it here. So the spoils system is the idea, it's a phrase, it's a good phrase, to the victor goes the spoils. Basically, if you win, you get the rewards of winning. So Jackson's argument is like, I won.
Sorry.
Oh my, don't be sorry, watch. Jackson's argument is, I won. I won this election, and I need the rewards of winning. So I'm going to give all these government jobs, all these jobs within the systems of government. It's called the bureaucracy now. But all these government jobs, right, like post office man and tax collector, I'm going to give all these important jobs to my supporters. The people that supported me, they need these jobs because they supported me. They were loyal. I'm going to give them the jobs in the government and get rid of all the other old people who've been in these government jobs who are part of that old generation of the way things used to be done. Right? It's the first time we see a huge turnover, a huge change in what's called the civil service, people that work for the government to support our country. And it's seen as a good thing, right? It's seen as very democratic. It's seen as like reflecting the will of the people. It's a way to reduce government corruption. It's a way to reduce incompetence by getting new people into these jobs. Right? Jackson's not the first to do this. He's the first to do it on a way larger scale, though. And his phrase that he uses to justify this is "get there." Like those guys who were in power before Quincy Adams and the old guard, get their rascals out and get our rascals in. Get our people in to do these jobs to support our followers to reward our followers for their support. Right? It creates this awesome political cartoon. This awesome political cartoon shows Jackson riding a pig with money. And it says, "To the victors belong the spoils," Andrew Jackson. And the pig, as you can see, is plundering, which means to steal, and bribery and fraud. This course is arguing against Jackson's policies and saying that Jackson, in giving all his supporters jobs, is stealing and bribing and creating fraud in the government, and it's not a good idea, and the like. So that's the spoil system. What ends up happening instead, though, oftentimes, is that you create more incompetence as you're putting people in jobs that don't know what the hell they're doing, and their only qualification for that job, is that they supported the president who's given them the job. So it does create some questionable decisions at the governmental level. But Jackson's going to create the spoil system, and we're going to see this carrying through all the way into period 6, which is why I teach it now, and we'll circle back to it in a couple months. Additionally, Jackson is a supporter of states' rights, not a strong national government. And that's going to cause this split between the nationalist Republicans like Clay and Quincy Adams with the older style Democrats. And Jackson's going to actually, as you know from the corrupt bargain, who does Jackson hate? Jackson hates Henry Clay. What does Clay believe in? Clay's American system. So Jackson, as president, is going to actually deal a couple of really significant blows to the American system. Jackson, by the end of our live session, you'll see, will have killed the American system dead. But for today, it's important that we talk about one veto. He has a lot of vetoes, a lot of laws he vetoes or cancels. But for today, we'll talk about the Maysville Road, which was a road proposed by Henry Clay. So Jackson is okay, believe it or not, would make sense, with spending federal money on federal projects, on projects that impacted the whole country. So, for example, if we go back to like the National Road, we'll go back to that if you guys don't mind. If we go back to the National Road, like Jackson will be fine paying money for this because it goes through Maryland, it goes through Pennsylvania, it goes through Ohio, goes through Indiana, goes through Illinois. Because this road is not just in one state, it's impacting the whole country, then we can spend national money for that. But part of Clay's American system was just using federal money for infrastructure projects all over the country because they would, in theory, benefit the country in one way or the other. Jackson doesn't like that idea. Jackson doesn't like that idea. He's okay with national projects, but he does not agree with the idea of spending federal money, national government money, on state-specific projects, meaning projects that are only in one state. So, for example, like today, if we needed to fix up Los Angeles Harbor to get more shipping in and more boats in because Los Angeles Harbor was in need of repairs, Jackson wouldn't be okay with that because that's just Los Angeles, right? That's just California. So California should pay for that ourselves. But if we needed to fix the 10 freeway, which goes from Los Angeles, it ends in Santa Monica or starts in Santa Monica, depends which way you're going. It goes from Santa Monica all the way to Arizona, all the way through New Mexico, all the way through Texas, all the way through Louisiana. The 10 freeway actually ends all the way in Florida. Jackson will be okay spending federal money on that because it's a national project. It hits the whole country, okay? So in this case, Clay and Congress authorized the Maysville Road. It's this new road. It's going to go through Kentucky. And Jackson vetoes it. Jackson's like, nope, sorry. A, that's a state-specific project. We're not paying for it. And B, that's Henry Clay's state. And I'm not doing anything to help Henry Clay, so he can go to hell. So Jackson vetoes funds to the Maysville Road because it's specifically in Kentucky. But that does help show us his ideology on projects, but also his personal vindictiveness, his personal anger and vitriol for Henry Clay, and that he's like, you thought no road for you. Shouldn't have done that corrupt bargain, you idiot. Look at you now. Over here, desperately begging for a road. Move along. All right. Jackson's going to also veto 7 other key bills or key laws of public works projects, including other roads and other canals, on that same justification, that they're state-specific projects, and thus the states themselves should pay for them, not the national government. Right. Kentucky is, of course, home of Henry Clay, who Jackson is never forgiven for the corrupt bargain. He never will forgive him because Jackson is a tough man who doesn't believe in forgiveness. So the last important thing to talk about in Jackson's first term that's going to carry into his second is Indian removal. One of the blackest marks on United States history, if we're going to be quite honest, which I think we should be. So Southerners specifically are quite disappointed with John Quincy Adams moving too slow in dealing with the Native American problems. Okay? Think about like the way, because my point in this class is that everything works together. Right? We talked last class about the cotton boom. Right? The cotton has become so profitable that Southerners are racing to spread out to gather up more land for cotton plantations. But that means spreading into the frontier where Native Americans are and have been for generations. Jackson promises when he's elected, because on this platform of westward expansion, states' rights, get rid of the Native Americans, he promises to act quickly, to get rid of the Native Americans, to move them out of the way, to either negotiate with them or force them out. But one tribe in particular causes the most problems altogether, and that's the Cherokee tribe. Now, the Cherokee tribe is in the southeastern United States at the time, Florida, Georgia. And the problem with the Cherokee tribe is they are not uncivilized. And I put uncivilized in quotation marks because who are we to determine what civilized is and isn't? But they're not uncivilized in the Western sense of civilization because they have a representative government, right? They pick their representatives, a Republican style of government, just like we do. They have an agrarian lifestyle, right? They're not nomadic. They sit, they farm, they've been there for generations. And they have a formal written spelled alphabet, So they check like all the boxes for what a civilized society would be, and they refuse to move. They're like, no, no, no. We signed a treaty when you moved us the first time. This is our land. We're staying on this land. We check all the boxes of like what you'd want for Native Americans here in America, so we're not going anywhere. Like, this is our land. This is our ancestors' land. We're staying right here. You'll read in your text analysis for your extension activity this week Jackson's argument in favor of removing them, which I think you'll find very interesting, and the Cherokee response, their argument for why they shouldn't be removed, which I think you'll also find very interesting. So pay close attention to both of those texts. Unfortunately for the Native Americans, gold is discovered in Georgia, in the land that the Native Americans, the Cherokee tribe, calls their own. Gold is discovered. So the state of Georgia abolishes Cherokee tribal rule. It says, sorry, you don't get to rule yourself anymore. Even though the national government signed a treaty with you, said you could rule yourselves here. Yeah, you don't get to do that anymore. Georgia, as a state, we're going to override what the national government said. Except you can't do that. We've been over that. And we are going to tell the Cherokees, you got to go. You got to leave. Sorry, we need that gold. We need that land. You guys got to get out of here. Jackson agrees, and Jackson asks the Democrats in Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, which says Native Americans, if they do not leave, will be forcibly removed from their land and taken to a reservation on the other side of the Mississippi River in modern-day Oklahoma that we'll call Indian country. Right? We've talked about this before, though. Native American tribes are all different. Different languages, different customs, different traditions, different all sorts of things, lifestyles. The U.S. government's going to take all of them and just put them in the same reservation and say, good luck, Native Americans, you're over there now. But still, the Cherokee are like, yeah, no, we're not leaving. We're not leaving. So they sued. They file a lawsuit that goes all the way to the Supreme Court. All the way to the Supreme Court. And the conclusion of these lawsuits, if you recall, John Marshall, still in charge of the Supreme Court as a Federalist, is that states themselves, like Georgia has no authority over the Native American tribes in Georgia. Native Americans are only supposed to answer to the national government. And thus, Georgia has no authority to kick out the Cherokee tribe, to remove the Cherokee tribe, because the Cherokee tribe signed a treaty that says this is their land. Right? 2 more John Marshall decisions. Georgia says, nope, sorry, we're not going to listen to you, John Marshall. And they continue to take Cherokee lands. They continue to let Georgia settlers encroach onto Cherokee lands. Now, in this case, the president's job is to enforce the law. All right, if we're going to simplify the presidency as dumbed down as possible. Congress passes the law. The judiciary interprets the law. The president enforces the law. Well, here the ruling is Georgia can't make these people leave. So Jackson should enforce that. And instead says, well, John Marshall made his decision. Let him enforce it. Meaning, I'm not going to do a damn thing to stop Georgia from taking that land because I agree with what's happening. It's really, really quite sad. A couple years later, after much fighting and conflict and convincing, eventually the tribes are removed. The Seminole from Florida, the Cherokee from Georgia, Alabama, the Creek Indians, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw. They're usually referred to as the 5 civilized tribes. And they're all removed on what becomes known as the Trail of Tears, with thousands of Native Americans die on the route on the way there. They are forcibly removed out to Native American territory in what becomes known as Oklahoma. Right? They take with them their culture. They leave their ancestral burial grounds where they've lived for thousands of years. And the government just condones it and authorizes it and pushes them out on their way. As you can see, the Seminole tribe leaves in 1832. The Creek tribe leaves in 1832. The Choctaw tribe leaves in 1830. The Chickasaw tribe leaves in 1832. And it's the Cherokee in 1835 that hold out the longest as they're filing these lawsuits and hoping that the government will do the right thing and allow them to stay where they've been allowed to stay before they're finally removed. And you can see the way that Oklahoma is divided, right? There's the Chickasaw territory, there's the Choctaw territory, there's the Creek and Seminole territory. So we see We see this terrible black mark in American history in a way that reflects the Jacksonian ideals of pro-white supremacy, Western expansion, and Native Americans out of the way. So that's where I'll leave it today. This era of Jacksonian democracy, though, I strongly suggest that you pause it here and take some notes in terms of what they believe in, and then kind of think about how that's different from what Jefferson believed in. There's some similarities and some differences. Much like Jefferson, they're going to believe in the common man, but even to a further extent than Jefferson. If you remember, Jefferson said, like, the people can be trusted if the people are educated. People are informed is the word he used. Jackson's like, the people can be trusted because they like me, to an extent. He argues, and the Jacksonian supporters argue, that people will always arrive at the right conclusions, and they're going to vote accordingly, according to what's best for them. Jacksonian democracy, this era, is categorized by universal male suffrage and much more popular elections, in which the voice of the people is much stronger. They believe in states' rights, state sovereignty, strict interpretation, but they also believe that the power that should be held in the national government is power that should be given to the executive, the presidency, right? Whereas Jefferson and them believed that the power belonged in the legislative branch with the will of the people. They believe in the rotation of office, which is like the spoil system, getting people in and out of offices so you get new, fresh blood. They believe in popular campaigning, meaning going right to people and asking them to vote, with parades and rallies and mudslinging and character assassinations and talking trash about the opponents and the like. Economically speaking, they believe in a phrase I'm going to use a lot going forward, laissez-faire policies, meaning keeping the government's hands off the economy, letting things regulate themselves. No bank, no tariff, no tax, all that stuff. Just laissez-faire means in French to let be or to let stand. They're very distrustful of banks, in that way similar to Jefferson. Very anti-debt, similar to Jefferson. And they believe in this idea of manifest destiny, much like Jefferson did. Right? That we need to keep spreading out, which is what motivates Native American removal, to spread out for opportunity for the everyday yeoman farmers. And in the South, at least, the Jacksonian Democrats will be very, very pro-expansion of slavery. So that's this new era of democracy. I'll talk about in class on our live session. Nullification crisis, which gets crazy. America almost has a civil war. Jackson's war on the bank, as well as some of the legacies of his presidency. So I hope that was helpful. I know it was a little longer this week, but Jackson's really, really important. I tell you this because I mean it, because I know it. College Board loves Jackson. So I'll make sure that we know Jackson well and kind of the dynamics that make up this unique and interesting era of American politics. Have a great day. I will see you in our live session soon, and I cannot wait.